Okay, so for this next video lecture, so we will be discussing about the procedures in assessing inherent and control risks. Okay, so the first is assessing inherent risk. So here, the auditor shall assess inherent risk or the identified risk of material misstatement at the assertion level. Okay, so in assessing the likelihood and its magnitude, meaning the possibility of the misstatement to occur as well as its materiality. Okay, so the auditor shall take into account how and the degree to which the inherent risk factors affects the susceptibility of relevant assertions to misstatement. Meaning, for example, misstatement in completeness, occurrence, existence, and so on. Okay. Another is risk of material misstatement at the financial statement level that affects the assessment of inherent risk for material misstatement also in the assertion level. Okay, so here, uh, the FS misstatement at the FS level is pervasive, meaning the auditor is considering that most part of the FS are misstated. And this can be related as well in the misstatement at the assertion level, where the auditor will check its accuracy, existence, occurrence, and so on. Okay, so basically, inherent risk is it is in the nature of the transaction, the account balance. Okay, that it or that the misstatement may exist. So another is the auditor assesses the occurrence or the potential occurrence of such misstatement as well as its materiality for identified risk material misstatement, because here the significance of the combination of the occurrence, likelihood of occurrence, and the materiality of potential misstatement will determine where on the spectrum of our inherent risk the identified risk is assessed. So this will affect the auditor's design also of the further audit procedures that he will perform in order to address the risk that was assessed. Okay, so meaning here the degree of the inherent risk assessed, okay, will be determined to help the auditor in designing his further audit procedures. So in assessing inherent risk, the auditor also uses his professional judgment to determine the significance of the combination of the potential of the misstatement to occur as well as its materiality or effect in the FS. Assessment of inherent risk also involves a judgment within a range. So this can be from a lower um, to higher level on the spectrum of our inherent risk. So the auditor will use his judgment on where in the range, okay, is risk will be assessed, or the level of inherent risk, whether it's low, moderate, or medium, or high, based on the nature, size, and complexity of the entity, as well as the assessed likelihood or occurrence and materiality, okay, of the misstatement in the inherent risk factors. Okay, so in considering the likelihood of a misstatement, the auditor considers the possibility also that a misstatement may occur based on consideration of the inherent risk factors. So, meaning, in this case, the auditor, as he applies his professional judgment, he will determine if a possible misstatement may exist, okay, in that particular transaction, account balance, or disclosure based on the nature, meaning inherent um, uh, the transaction, account balance, and disclosure cannot do away from having a misstatement because it is in its nature. It will have a misstatement. Okay, on the other hand, in considering the magnitude of a misstatement, meaning its materiality, the auditor will consider the qualitative and quantitative aspects of the possible misstatement. Okay, so this is how he will assess the inherent risk, not only quantitatively, but also he will consider qualitative factors that adds, okay, to the possibility of the existence of a material misstatement. So, for instance, misstatements in the assertions may be judged to be material, maybe because of its size, nature, or the circumstances. Again, based on the professional judgment and the level of materiality that was determined or preliminarily determined by the auditor. So the higher the combination of the potential occurrence of the misstatement as well as its materiality. So in this case, the auditor's assessment also will be higher for inherent risk. Uh, Whereas the lower the combination, so in this case, the assessment of the auditor for inherent risk will also be lower. So it has a direct relationship. Okay, so of course, uh, higher likelihood of occurrence, so higher inherent risk. Higher or the more material the misstatement is, the higher also the inherent risk is. Okay, so that's how it is assessed by the auditor. Okay, so in this video lecture, we will continue with the second type of assessment. So this is under or for the control risks this time. For the control risk, so this is the risk that material misstatement could occur in an assertion about a class of transaction, account balance, or disclosures, and that could be material, either individually or aggregated. Okay, that it cannot be prevented, detected, or corrected on a timely basis by the internal controls of the entity. This is control risk, whereas inherent risk is in the nature of the transaction, account balance, and disclosure that it will have misstatement. Okay, this time control risk relates to the internal control system of the entity. So the assessment of the control risk refers to the process of the evaluation of the operating effectiveness of the internal control, okay, in terms of preventing, detecting, and correcting a material misstatement. So we've mentioned also this in our previous video lecture, if you could still remember. So the auditor should detect and correct risk in terms of financial statement assertions. However, if it was found out and assessed by the auditor that the internal control of the entity is strong, then he can rely on that internal control also, that it can detect and correct the risk of misstatements in the FS. However, if the internal control is weak, so it is the opposite, meaning the auditor will no longer rely on those internal controls. Instead, he will do more substantive procedures to gather uh, appropriate and sufficient audit evidence to support his opinion. So based on the auditor's understanding of the internal control, such as his evaluation of the design, determination of its implementation, and the identified controls, so the auditor will make a preliminary assessment, okay, of the control risk, if that is high, moderate, or low. So the auditor may also assess control risk at high or maximum level for some or all or some of all assertions when the entities, okay, in this case, the control risk will be assessed at high or maximum if these are present. First, if the entity's internal controls is ineffective, so meaning control risk is high. Another is in evaluating the effectiveness of the controls would not be efficient. Okay, meaning the auditor has no plan to perform test of controls simply because he found out that the internal controls are ineffective. So again, control risk in this case is high. Okay, conversely, control risk will be assessed at less than high or below maximum or low. Okay, when these are present, meaning the auditor is able to identify controls relevant to the assertion which are likely to prevent, detect, and correct a material misstatement, meaning to say internal control is effective. So in this case, control risk is low. Okay, another is the auditor plans to test the operating effectiveness of controls. So, for example, the auditor plans to perform tests of controls to support the assessment. So, again, in this case, it is believed that the internal controls are strong. So, in this case, again, control risk is assessed as low. Okay, so those are for the procedures in assessing inherent and control risk. So we will continue with the procedures on the revision of the preliminary assessment of control risks. So here, as the audit procedures are already performed by the auditor, so he will gather more evidence about or related to the internal controls of the entity. So basically, his preliminary assessment will change, okay, depending on what he has found out during the audit. Okay, so here, based on the results of the test of controls, the auditor should evaluate whether the internal controls are designed and operating as intended based on the auditor's understanding of the controls and his preliminary assessment of the control risks. If the result of the test of control supports the initial assessment, there is no need to revise. Okay? Because basically, what is preliminarily assessed is the same as what is existing actually, or how the internal controls are implemented. Okay, so meaning the same uh, is or meaning the status of the internal control is the same as the preliminary assessment of the auditor. So meaning in this case there is no need to revise the initial plan substantive procedures. However, conversely, if the results of the test of controls, okay, meaning in this case the auditor have already tested the internal control. In the first one, it was preliminarily assessment. Okay. Now, in this case, if the results of the test of controls provide audit evidence that the controls were not operating effectively at relevant times during the audit, then the preliminary assessment of control risk should be revised. Meaning, in this case, if the evidence shows that the controls were not operating effectively, so it means to say that the internal controls are weak. So more substantive procedure should be performed by the auditor. Okay, so in this case, the auditor can revise the preliminary assessment of the control risk. So he will increase it at a higher level, so therefore more substantive procedures, okay, to be performed. Okay, so those are for the assessment of inherent and control risks.